Thank you very much, Craig. Look forward to your panel later on in the program. So, kicking us off this year's conference is a panel that gets right to the heart of the protracted crisis that has been 2020 and how newsrooms have pivoted again and again to respond to working conditions and stories on a scale with which they've never before been confronted. Joining me today is Ellen Crook, VP of News for Tegna, Brian Kennedy, VP of Global News Gathering and Planning from ABC News, and Barb Moshard, SVP of News for Hearst Television. Welcome to you all.
Thank you.
So I want to dive right in and confront one of the earliest crises that each of you had to face was having to evacuate your newsrooms in March and switch to remote production for a majority of your personnel. It's a challenge to which pretty much every newsroom rose quite quickly, but 9 months later, that transition has seen a lot of the rough edges smoothed out and the industry still producing remotely, but it also still has its limitations. So Barb, I want to start with you. Technically, personnel-wise or otherwise, where does remote production present the biggest challenges to you still?
Thanks, Michael, and thank you for having us and allowing us to talk about this. It's remarkable looking back now 9 months, 10 months, however long it's been, to believe what was possible is possible and to see how we've been able to evolve over that time. So I'm really pleased to be able to say, congratulations and well done to all of our colleagues as we continue to go through this really unprecedented time. To answer your question about the challenges, I think the biggest challenges are really the risk to connectivity, right? Because we can pretty much do anything we need to do from almost anywhere. Clearly, we still need to have some people in our buildings, and I think we've all worked really hard to ensure that we can do that safely or as safely as possible. But there's always a risk that you're set up to do something and the connectivity is just not going to be there. And as we're preparing for a big winter storm here, that's one of the thoughts that was on my mind for our stations in Baltimore and others. How are we going to be prepared? But we had the same concerns during the hurricanes. Let's make sure we put our people in places where there is backup, where they do have the resources they need. But connectivity would be one of the biggest, I think, continued challenges. I think we've gotten pretty good at, roughing, as you said, smoothing out the edges, making the presentation look good, getting smart about how we produce shows from remote locations. But we're still dependent on the connections working and our people being able to continue to perform their duties because there's been such an increase in the risk to their health along the way as well.
Mm-hmm. How about you, Ellen? What about your challenges with remote production? Did it complicate your election coverage, for instance, at all?
Sure, of course it did. But what we did, as Barb said, we brought in extra people during that time. And so because it gave us time to put in dividers into our buildings, to create seating charts, so that we could have extra people for a short period of time for the elections. And to go through that. Our multi-skilled journalists have all trained and know how to edit in their laptops, so remote editing, and they're much better at it after this year because they're forced to do it, into it. Having our anchors and using, TVU apps, being live from their home, it's remarkable what we were able to do. But take away any problems with technology and things, the real problem is that in-person, spontaneous communication. It's the chemistry between the on-air talent that no technology can really make that better. That's really the greatest challenge. But I'll tell you, the greatest election challenge we have is right now. I'm in Georgia and we have our stations, WXIA and WMAZ. And election day, the biggest one probably that they've ever faced, where the whole world is watching Georgia, is January 5th. Just a few days after everybody's been with their families and traveling, and while the numbers are surging. So that election, we really have to keep people out of the building and do as much as remote as we possibly can. So having, a major story elections just a few weeks after the holiday season is quite a challenge for our journalists.
The pivoting never stops.
Right.
Brian, your purview is global news gathering at ABC News. Does that make remote production conditions even trickier for you? And what have been some of the tougher moments exacerbated by your production conditions for ABC News?
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm happy to be part of this. And in a way, it made it easier because we've always been solving for a wide area. And so when we had to solve for even a small area, a lot more remotes were happening in New York City, in people's apartments, in their homes, things like that. So we were already a little bit prepared for that. We got lucky with some of our technology having been implemented not long before the pandemic, not intending to use it in the ways we did. But the challenge of not only having someone be home and be broadcasting from home or appearing live from home, but how do you get, if they're anchoring a program, give them teleprompter, give them return video without having anyone there to help them. So that was probably the biggest challenge that we were, fortunate enough with some of our technology choices, and just in the months preceding COVID, unrelated to COVID, that we were able to scale up and deliver that. So such that, Good Morning America and The View, they could sort of be whole from a broadcasting, from an anchor sense, at home with the tools they need to command the show the way they wanted to. We've tweaked that and gotten that better, but I think we were very fortunate.
So, Ellen, as you indicated already, we have every indication of a rough winter ahead in terms of the virus. So I wonder how each of you are bolstering or modifying the safety protocols you've already had in place around that. Let's start with Barb on that.
Yeah, I think we've all had to continue to your point, evolve and look for new things we can do. I think, we have felt like we've been very careful from day one, but I know that as we got into the summer months and things looked a little better, we tried to bring a handful of people back. There were maybe a couple of anchors to address the point that Ellen made, that you lose the chemistry, you lose the engagement, you lose all of the collaboration that's going on. So we tried to bring a couple of people back in, still very distanced with all of the guidelines. And as we got into the fall, we just decided we're gonna roll back a little bit. We don't have to have everyone in. We can solo anchor shows. We can figure out how to produce them in a way. So we've continued to look for even others who perhaps we thought we needed in the buildings that we don't need, and we found new ways. Again, with the incredible advancements of technology, we've created sections in our buildings where a producer can booth a show still in the building, but completely out of control room, because we don't want them, any more people in one space than they need to be. Like Ellen, we've got plexiglass, between people, but anything we can do to further the distance, to limit the number of people. And so, to the point now where we not only are we taking all these steps to do our best to protect people, but we are finding more and more people coming down with COVID or being exposed, right? So now we don't even have a choice. They're not going to be in the buildings. So we've got to find creative ways. Obviously, the biggest challenge that we're working on and have been since the beginning is how do we support another television station should we need to do that? And I think we've all put plans into place. Will it be pretty? I don't know. I would hope so. We practice and try to make ourselves as prepared, but it's just a constant evolution of what we're doing. And thankfully we have great tools and we've got great people who can figure out how to help us, make the magic happen when it's necessary.
So where are you with that evolution, Ellen?
Same as Barb, that we're on a cycle that reflects the cycle that the country has faced, right? So we had everybody go home in March, right? And then we brought some more people back before the elections, and more of our on-air anchors. I think our viewers, viewers in general, were tired of seeing anchors, from their living room, and really moved to maybe have more people come home. We figured out a way to have producers produce remotely, which has helped a lot. So we've really worked on, the safety in the building, minimizing as few people in there as possible, continuing to upgrade the ability to do things remotely. For our field crews, who are truly most at risk, that we have to worry about the most, we continue to, our guidelines that we put out March 13th are still in effect, that we do not have in-person interviews, that only if you do have an in-person interview, it has to be outside and at least 12 feet away. There are some exceptions, but it has to be approved by the news director and things have to be in place. I mean, imagine that. that we're still putting on and incredible amounts of news and great storytelling and great investigations, and we're not doing in-person interviews for the most part. I mean, that it is remarkable when you think about what's happened. But really, the place we are in now is just like the rest of the world. There's fatigue. There's, I forgot to put a mask on, or we thought we could just drive to a story together and it'd be okay. It's constant communication and reminders of their safety, and the safety guidelines is really where we are now. And we're gearing up for what will happen after the holidays, starting to move people out now. Poor news directors are not only having to figure out, great journalism decisions, but also, trying to figure out who might be visiting grandma, because I'm going to have to figure out how to have them be remote. I mean, it's this whole extra layer of work that they're going through. But it really is the communication of two things: space, make sure there's space between people, and wear a mask. And we're fortunate that, of our employees who may have gotten COVID, it's mostly people from, not that they're getting it from the building, but it's from things that they're doing in their own personal life.
Right.
And our numbers are going up just as we're seeing the nations go up.
Yeah. You mentioned the word fatigue in terms of vigilance with just keeping yourself safe. There's also, fatigue, and this has come up in a number of discussions I've had recently with just the coverage of the virus itself and how how news organizations are confronting that. So I wonder, and this is for any of you to take, are you updating the way that your organizations are tackling the subject of the virus, just because it has been with us for so long and there is a fatigue setting in, perhaps both in the newsrooms and among the viewers? And Brian, let's start with you on that.
Yeah, I think it's always a challenge to continue to find new ways to tell a story that continues to not be very different. But the size, the scale, the scope of this story is so massive that I think there's been a lot of attention to trying to get in and make it personal. That's not new to the news business, but as you keep telling these stories, they don't feel from one day to the next any less heartbreaking or harrowing for the people impacted and the people caring for each other. And I think that's, trying to remember that, because there are so many people affected, and as the cases spike, more people know people closer to them, and I think it's affecting people more. And how can you not cover that? And so I think it doesn't feel like there's a fatigue in covering it. We hear about it a little bit, but I think just being consistent and just realizing there are so many stories we're not even getting to, even though we're covering it every day, almost all day. So it's I don't think we've let up on that, but it's something that's constantly on the minds of everyone.
What about Barb or Ellen in your newsrooms? Are you finding you have to make a bit of a tactical shift in the coverage, or?
Yeah, when we started, what we were finding was giving the COVID numbers. Each state, it was different. It was hard. You're giving numbers, but they weren't being put in perspective. So we created at our graphics hub in Denver, we created for all of our stations an interactive COVID numbers tool, which allows each station to be able to put in the numbers, immediately. They could do it 2 minutes before they go on the air, and to be able to interact with it and explain it. And so really, every month we're trying to update it and give it a fresh look and give new ways to analyze it, to help put numbers in perspective, because national news, does a great job in the overall numbers, but really local news was so essential and is so essential to our communities to understand what's happening in my neighborhood, what's happening at my hospitals, and having really great graphics that we could present as just a basic tool to all the stations that can localize it and tell that story that they might not have had the ability to do at their local level. And then we've had trainings and updating it. And now we're moving into the vaccine and creating vaccine teams at each station. Each station has put together ones with investigative people, with medical experts, because the distribution, again, national news will be able to cover it in a broad sense, but the decisions and the information is local. It's going to be a state decision at how it's done, and locally they're going to need to know. So that's another time when local news has become so essential. So, really helping our stations to move through that. And then as Brian so beautifully said, it really is about the humanity of it. We can talk about the numbers all day long, but like stations like WKYC, who does a daily piece on the face of COVID and the humanity of it, and those who are recovering, those who've had loss, those who've suffered, trying to bridge that with the numbers, and analysis, local analysis of the numbers has been very important.
Yeah, I would just add, it's for us, it's the same in terms, it's all about context and perspective and figuring out how to help tell the individual story at the local markets. The humanity, obviously, very important piece of it. And I think it's been really interesting, to the point Ellen made earlier, it kind of ebbs and flows. The story has, it's been consistent, right? We've had to be consistent with the story, but there was a moment in time, I think, when our focus really shifted to the calls for social justice, and we were trying to balance that and what was happening with COVID. And then we're looking at the election. And so there were just a number of really big stories, and we had to figure out how we were going to divide our time effectively. Certainly right now, there's little more important than what's happening within the coronavirus and the vaccines. And so, making sure that our audience understands what we're giving them, when we're going to give it to them, where they can depend on us within our newscast, on our digital platforms. I think making sure we're communicating that is something we're trying to do effectively, because people are dependent, to the point that was being made, whether it's from a national perspective, but certainly local, dependent on when can I get a vaccine. It's as simple as that, but we've got to be the ones that they know we're going to be able to provide that information. We've got to figure out that we're set up in order to do so.
Right. And given this volume and all this data that's coming in and being updated daily, are you all finding that your digital platforms have taken an outsized role in the past year to be an additional conduit for that information?
Go ahead, Alan, you're nodding your head.
I'm nodding my head because absolutely. I mean, it has been, our video views have more than doubled in the aggregate across all of our stations. And what we found during the COVID, and especially initially when it first broke out, that search traffic, there was such an increase in search traffic for issues regarding that. And that became our Bible throughout it. Everybody's asking today, how do I get a stimulus check? Everybody's asking today, can you, is a handkerchief mask as good as a regular mask? Everybody's asking. And every day there was a unique question that we could answer for people, that we could use data, graphics and created videos that our stations could use, and our stations created incredible ways. But the search traffic that we saw, 800 million search referrals across TEGNA, and which is an increase for us. And that's because we're trying to answer those questions that people had. And it's such a unique thing to have. It was 3 stories of our lifetime all in 1 year while we're all remote. And we were all working on the same story. We have 62 stations across the country, and normally everybody's working. There might be 1 or 2 stories a day that maybe we're all doing. But for a year now, almost, we're all working the same major stories in different angles. So we were able to really help on the digital aspect of it. But we also saw, with the increase in search in social media disinformation and rumors, that it really was our digital platforms that were able to answer those and to dispel them. Our Verify franchise, we trained people in disinformation training, but it was on social media, and the growth in that was really where we were able to answer people's questions and also dispel the false information. And then streaming was huge growth this year. Our Roku apps, and we're about to launch our Fire TV, our Amazon apps, and the growth that we've seen in that has been fantastic. because people are at home. We've seen much more increase in the streaming video. So it really has been, it's, every year we're growing in digital in all of our platforms, but this year it has been a tremendous increase.
I've got a lot of different points I want to tackle. So, but one I want to just come back to that Ellen, you raised kind of briefly before, and to have you each just briefly talk to this, which is collaboration and how, we're doing this all via technology. Some of us are more used to it than others. But I wonder, starting with you, Barb, what have you done to keep creativity and collaboration flowing within the group, given these remote circumstances? How are you compensating by technology or other means?
Yeah, really important for all of us to figure it out. I would tell you that in some ways we're probably collaborating better. We're not in the same rooms, which is really, that's a missing piece. And, sadly, we know there are people who may decide not to do this job anymore because what they loved about the job was being in the newsroom. Although I keep telling people, hold on, because we're going to get there again. I believe that, I'm just not sure when. But I do think that, we've found ways to make sure that this is happening, that we are on screens with each other. It's not the same as in person, but there were people who maybe couldn't participate in an editorial meeting because they were out in the field or because they didn't start their days. And so we've tried to take advantage of the opportunity to bring more people in and to ensure that we're doing more regular Zoom, WebEx, whatever you call it, whatever you use. But we've been trying to do more of those meetings. In the beginning of the pandemic, I'll never forget, there were people saying, well, we're just, doing some phone calls. I said, don't do phone calls, do video, video calls, get people on screen, because they weren't thinking that way, right? We didn't do that. Now, nobody picks up a cell phone anymore. They call you on Teams or whatever your device is. So I think, to your question, Michael, I think, yes, it's still hard. And I think we have to make those meetings happen. We have to invite people and remember that there are people who are isolated out there that aren't regularly involved in these meetings, and get them involved. And I think it's also helpful to find creative ways to get them engaged. We always try to celebrate people's birthdays when we have a news director call, right? Silly thing, and they laugh at me when I do it. But if they know that on that call we're going to recognize somebody's birthday, it's something else to look forward to. And I think in today's world, we're all looking for things to look forward to. So finding, moments that we can make and making sure we're inviting people in. And we've also done, I think, a fairly good job, or we're trying to do a good job of having people who are remote up on screen in the newsrooms, in meetings, helping throughout the day. EPs, if they're not in the building, can be on a computer screen. And again, not the same, but they can still be listening to some of the conversations that are going on. And so the collaboration can still happen. Maybe not as effectively, but I've been impressed with how much we've been able to accomplish.
Brian, have you found some good workarounds?
Yeah, I just say I would agree with everything Barbara said. I think there's three things. The technology has definitely helped. The adoption of that technology, as Barbara mentioned, is key. People now use it. It's not, they trust it. They have a lot of reps with it, so they're comfortable using the medium. But I think it's also lent itself to transparency. The only way we all survive in this business, in this time in this business, is to share. We have the opportunity to share more, and we're sharing more. At least that's what I've found. And by sharing more and giving more access to the information to more people that they might not have had otherwise, gives them a head start to know where they should go with decisions, or where the direction might be going, editorial or operationally on a particular day. So I think we've kind of loosened, not that we were intentionally not transparent, but it just through the course of your day, you didn't have as much opportunity. But now you built that in, or we have in some ways to sort of share that information, or overshare in some cases. And I think that's had a bit of a benefit, that as much as we want to get back together and feed off of the energy we give each other, I think there's some benefit. I hope the transparency piece remains beyond the COVID situation.
And how about you, Ellen?
We are in a love-hate relationship with Zoom. There is definitely Zoom fatigue. Nobody can just pick up the call anymore. Every meeting is face-to-face. So I know everyone can relate to that. And people are sitting in front, and especially news people are used to moving around, and they didn't, want to go into journalism because they don't like sitting at a desk, and they're spending a lot more time sitting at a desk staring at a screen. So there's that issue, which brings us to the stress of our employees. And I can honestly say that we are more in tune with the mental health of our journalists than we've ever talked about before or discussed before. We've even had multiple Zoom. Our HR department have multiple Zoom webinars and sessions to help with stress. I started in this business when you don't talk about it, and that is not something that's discussed in a newsroom. And boy, is it wonderful to see how much that has changed in 2020 and how we're paying attention to that. So Zoom just plays a little role in that, but I think we're at least being very intentional to make sure everybody's okay. And when we're not remote, we might not be thinking about that as much. If someone looks at us and they look okay in person, then everything's okay. So it's in some ways there's been a blessing that we've talked about this a lot more. We're also much more intentional. I traveled, I'm sure Barb and Brian are the same way. I would travel to stations and I spent most of my time on a plane, and I might spend really good quality time with 3 or 4 news directors a month. I'm now talking to every news director every couple weeks with in-depth sessions. And so in a way our communication is different, and it's not in person, but it's much more intentional, and there's actually more communication, as Brian and Barb alluded to.
That's interesting. I want to tackle the election. This was probably the most challenging election any of you have ever faced. We knew in advance that we'd almost certainly not have a result on election night. And of course, plans were made and continuously revised as the date got closer. Everyone was ready for almost anything to happen. Just very briefly, I'd like each of you to frame out very broadly how your own planning turned out to be sufficient or insufficient to how the event actually played out, both on election day and in the days thereafter. And Brian, can we start with you on that?
Yeah, I think preparing for it not being over, the election results not being known on election night, was huge, and that was great. I think there are a lot of secret feelings that it really would be known, but so planning it really helped a lot. But I think it culminates for us, what was started in September 2019 when we hosted, I think, our first, debate. That and then just had been nonstop since then. And then COVID came along, and we adjusted and adapted to that. And the, covering the social, outpouring, around early summer, late spring, it felt like, it was the finish line in some ways of a season that had gone on for a very, very long time. So even though we were prepared for it, I think, it still was, everyone was still a great sense of relief as we could sort of, kind of move on a little bit. And that's kind of, it's gradually come down, not all in one day as we've been so used to in prior election years, but definitely I think we were prepared for it, but there wasn't a lot of gas in the tank if it had continued to go at that pace for much longer.
Yeah. Ellen, what about you?
Pre-planning started, like Brian said, and we were focused on the disinformation. That's really what we did. We partnered up with firstdraft.org and trained all 3,000 plus journalists in January, before all this started, on how to responsibly dispel false information, how to help educate your audience to be better social media and news consumers. And boy, did that make a difference. We did it again in August, specifically towards the disinformation that they would begin to see on the weeks leading up to election, particularly targeting Black and Hispanic communities. And so our teams were really prepared for what they saw. And of course, as Brian said, nobody called it election night. We all called it election month. We knew what was coming. But we had 2 goals, and we talk about this in every meeting, and every news director talked about it across our stations. One is the safety of our employees. during elections. And there was a lot, so that you had the COVID safety. You know, we couldn't bring experts into the building. So what are some creative, interesting way to have election experts? We had experts on roofs. We had, you know, big parking lot tents put up so we could put the experts out there. We were really prepared because we knew local experts would help. Another thing of pre-planning that we did was voter access teams. Every station created voter access teams. And they weren't covering campaigns or politicians. They were teaching and explaining something we've never had to do before: how to vote, when to vote, why things are happening regarding the voting process, holding our local officials accountable to make sure that there was voter access for all members of their community. And
you were
how
teaching
they
civics.
were going, and how they were going to provide, you know, election night for journalists, we all know how it's going to come down, and we're going to use AP. We had to, and it was done differently in every community. Our journalists had to dig into, when are you going to be releasing early voting? Will that come early? Will that come later? And then making sure that the voter access teams were educating our communities. This is all aspects. I've been doing elections for 25, 30 years. Never had to do that type of work and that pre-work. And our newsrooms did such a beautiful job of prepping and pre-planning that. And then on election, you know, that as we got up to it, we had this saying that we as local journalists would not contribute to the chaos. You know, making sure that all of our journalists were buttoned down on social media, that each station chose only their few sources that they would use for information on election night. Again, something we never had to do before in guiding them through elections. So it was safety and trustworthiness were the two things that we really focused on for elections.
And Barb?
And I can't add a lot more than that. I mean, I think, you know, we all work to prepare our people to be, you know, able to discern the right information, who the right contacts were, all the regular preparation, you know. But I do think that one of the most important things we did, to what both Ellen and Brian were talking about, was prepare the audience. The viewers needed to understand what was going to happen. Obviously, we needed to be prepared, and I expect our people to be prepared, but we needed the audience to know what to expect and how we could help them through. And you talked about civics. You know, we created something about this time last year or a little before that was called What's the Deal? And it's very much a, what's the deal with the Electoral College? What's the deal with voting? It was done in the, you know, think about the Schoolhouse Rock. So it's a modern day version of that was created out of our bureau. And we used it for exactly that: civics lessons, ways to kind of educate without any positions, without, you know, trying to go beyond just what do you need to know so you can be an educated consumer. So I think, you know, just to reinforce, I think it was as much about preparing our audiences as it was preparing ourselves for what we knew was going to be different. And as Ellen noted, through everything we've done this year, covering protests, covering hurricanes, covering snowstorms, it's all through the lens of, we're in a pandemic, and how do we do it keeping our people safe? And I think it's remarkable that we've been able to keep our audiences informed. It's not always pretty, but it's been pretty good all the way through, despite the challenges.
Something I want to be sure to tackle in the time we have left is the crisis of trust that the industry is facing. It might be the biggest crisis that the news is facing of many. Audiences are deeply polarized. The notion of commonly held facts has been completely undermined. You can no longer count on a baseline of empirical truths at almost any level when you're addressing your audiences. News organizations always like to talk about how they avoid politics, they just report it straight, but you can't say it's that simple anymore. So I just if you can give us kind of a page of how you are rewriting your playbooks around that reality of a deeply polarized, mistrustful electorate, starting with you, Brian.
Well, I think it's you mentioned it, but it's you know, straightforward storytelling, and I think the problem sometimes lies not there's lots of there's good storytelling and a lot of fact-based storytelling out there. How do you get that to people who aren't following you or aren't following your stories or the way you're presenting your story? And it gets glommed into the more general media bucket that so I think there's, telling the story is only part of the equation, and the rest of it is getting it to people, how to get them to trust it. I honestly, I don't know the answer to that, but I think it's a challenge both of telling the story in a fair, straightforward, accurate way, but also in getting to people who may not see your version of reporting. And I think that's a danger to us all. You don't see things that your algorithm or who you follow doesn't push that to you. And I think we hold individual responsibility to try to find that and see what is being reported out there.
Barb, how are you tackling this reality that we're confronted with?
Yeah, Michael, you and I have talked about this before. It's always a challenge, but I think, I always go back to our jobs have always been to find the facts, find the truth, and report it. I think today we are best served when we're very transparent. Who are the sources? What is it that we, how many different sources did we go to verify this information? Trying to reinforce through some of the messaging. I know Ellen talked about verifying. I'm sure she'll talk more about that. We have our own brand of it, which is Get the Facts, but it's an effort, behind the scenes effort to make sure that we are digging in, we are finding the information, and we're helping the audience understand the process by which we go through to report it. We're not going to make people who don't believe us, but I think we get closer to helping them to believe us if they see how we gather that information. And also if we as organizations and journalists maintain that independence. When journalists cross lines and become, show a position, they will be questioned. Whether they come to the table, we all come to the table with, biases, but that's why we have rooms full of people to collaborate and work closely together to ensure that we're not bringing those biases into our reporting, but rather helping each other identify the information. So I think it's about process. I think it's about transparency. I think it's about, the commitment to report the truth and the facts, and understanding not everyone's going to believe what you say, but in a local market, part of it is the relationships we have with our communities. And so I think it's an advantage for the local markets, maybe over the national news, because we have those relationships. Doesn't mean they always trust us, but they do more often than not. And I think that's because of the way we approach it.
Well, Ellen, Verify has come up now a couple of times, and it's really expanded this past year. Has it been an effective tool in terms of being plausible for skeptical viewers? And are you able to quantify in any way how it's helped to rebuild trust or reinforce trust at your stations?
How it's grown. And I'll give you, the history of Verify is that it came up from our innovators. In 2015, before this current administration took office, trust was an issue then with with journalism. I think people think that it got worse now, but it didn't begin with this current administration. And so it was asking our innovators, our employees, what could we do to gain trust? And we've come to now, we're 5 years into it, and we have a philosophy that, yes, as journalists, our mission is to seek the truth, but at Tegna, now in 2020 and beyond, we also have the mission to stop the spread of false information. And Verify is a form for us to do it. It's all done through research. It's about putting your sources up front. It's about taking the questions from our audience on all platforms that they want to know about what's true and what's not, and then in a form that stands out from the sea of sameness of all news stories. But boy, did it grow in 2020. Our visitors are up 510% in our Verify stories. We started Snapchat discovery for Verify. Just in September, we started it. 7 million unique views. 50% of them are under the age of 24. The answers, the response we're getting from people, oh, we need this. We need somebody just who's in the middle of it to take a look at this information and break it down for us. It's so much so that it has been announced that Adam Ostro, our Chief Digital Officer, is starting a national verified brand and a whole separate team regarding this, because there is such a hunger for it. And in 2020, it truly proved, and not just about COVID or the elections, but some of our most popular stories were about the revolution for social justice and what was really happening in certain instances, and how can we explain some of these things, and being able to verify that and having a form that all of our newsrooms are trained on really made a difference for us. And we think that this is something that will really grow in the next several years.
So just briefly, you have a national team, and then are there point people in each newsroom who are sort of designated on Verify?
Sure. So we have a national team, and that sounds more glorious than it is. It's a journalist, an MSJ, and a fantastic editor that works out of Charlotte. But they work out of what the stations ask them to do. So it's not that Tegna pushes it out. The stations give them the story ideas that they want to do, and they do that on a daily basis. And then each station is trained on how to do Verify. And each station, some stations have verified teams, like WUSA has like a 5-person verified team. KHOU does in Houston. Some of other stations, they might not have a specific team, but multiple people are trained on how to do it. But it's become an everyday tool for facing the disinformation and the false things that are being spread, whether it be by Uncle Bob on Facebook, or whether it be by a politician, or their local mayor, or their football coach. It's people want to see something that's clearly different, that's going to break out what's true and what's not. And during breaking news, it's been huge. And we actually have a format where it's, here's what we know to be true, here's what we know to be false, and here's what we're working on that we don't know. And I was trained as a journalist, you would never put something out that you didn't know, that either you knew was false or you just didn't touch it. But if the numbers are so high and it's being shared, we now feel that that's part of journalism, is to put it out there and say, this hasn't been proven yet. Don't share this yet. That is the role of journalists now.
And that's what transparency can look like, pragmatically speaking. I want to get to just a few minutes left, so I want to touch on a couple of key things quickly. One is the safety of the journalists. They've got a big target on their back this year. The job is becoming more and more dangerous. We've talked about their mental health, but there's also their literal health, the danger they face from the virus and from other people in the field. So just really, really briefly, Barb, are you having to do anything further to protect your journalists looking ahead into next year?
We have continually provided security when there were situations where they felt that there could be more danger. Sometimes it's just a matter of somebody says, I don't feel safe, and so we'll provide security as that's needed. We continue, as Ellen noted, it's a constant discussion on everything we do. So we will be in position to provide anything that our journalists need to keep them safe, because you're right, it's going to be a continual piece of what we do moving forward.
Brian, are you having to do more at ABC News?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a safety layer to everything. It's obviously not just COVID. And so that, I think people, because it's a constant discussion, people have a little bit easier time sort of bringing it up if they have any concerns at all. And then there's things we can do, not cover a story, cover it differently, add security, vet it more thoroughly. So yeah, lots of different things we can do differently and have been.
Okay.
I'll just add that security now is a major part of what we do. It used to be only for certain things. Now there is a chief head of security. Now there are security protocols. Now we've had to give people assigned that at each station. That has been a major change in 2020.
Yeah, of course, and news organizations at all levels are facing this. The last thing I want to ask, and very important, it came up in a conversation you and I had, Ellen, previously. You had said the most lasting impact of 2020 will be the racial reckoning that we have faced as a country. And I just wonder if everyone can talk very briefly to how you're seeing that play out in your newsrooms, how we will frame it, look at it, engage with the subject of race, and how it's a lived experience at your respective newsrooms. And if you want us to start just with the minute we have left on that, Ellen.
Yeah, I mean, as we talked about, the presidential election will move on. COVID will eventually move on. But I truly believe the awakening that has happened in journalism, companies across the country, the changes that are being made to bring more diversity within the leadership in journalism, I believe that in history will be the real lasting effect of 2020 in news gathering, and for the good. There has been a true awakening in that, and I see it across all companies, and the need to be more reflective of our communities. And I believe that is really, when we look back in history, that will be the most important and lasting thing that has happened in journalism this year.
Barb, do you see that happening as well in your?
Yeah, I think in addition to that, and I would agree with that we're all going to be doing a better job and continuing to focus on that. I think we're also looking at how we report the news and how we focus on the way we cover stories, and whether or not we put more emphasis on that. We have an entire project community which is really geared at focusing our coverage to ensure that not only are we reflecting our communities with our teams, with our leadership, but that we're reflecting them in the stories that we tell.
And Brian, does this track with ABC News?
Yeah, absolutely. I think not just in the stories we tell, but in behind the camera, a high priority for what we do. And the success is, as Ellen mentioned, is not letting the momentum, not letting the passion for the movement to change or to slow down. That's going to be the true tell a year out, 2 years out, 5, 10 years. It has to keep up, or it will not change. So that's and I think everyone's aware of that.
Okay, well, unfortunately, we have come to the end of our time. I could talk to all of you for much, much longer if we had the chance to. So thank you so much to each of you for being with me for this conversation. Really appreciate it, and good luck in the next year.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.